Welcome everyone. My name is Dr. Liz Burton-Crow. I'm the Director of Education for the Carullo Center for Nonviolence. Welcome back to Living One, a free monthly webinar series where presenters from around the world share their vision about psychology, life, and culture in the absence of animal exploitation. Through Living One, we attempt to answer the question, we know what's wrong, but what does right look like? This month, we welcome Zoe Weil. She is the co-founder and president of the Institute for Humane Education. At IHE, Zoe created the first graduate programs in comprehensive humane education, linking human rights, environmental preservation, and animal protection, which are offered online through an affiliation with Antioch University. Zoe is a frequent keynote speaker at education and other conferences and has given 6 TEDx talks, including her acclaimed TEDx, The World Becomes What You Teach. She is the author of 7 books, including The World Becomes What We Teach, Educating a Generation of Solutionaries, Nautilus Silver Medal winner, Most Good, Least Harm, Moonbeam Gold Medal winner, Claude and Medea, and above all, Be Kind, Raising a Humane Child in Challenging Times. Zoe holds master's degree from Harvard Divinity School and the University of Pennsylvania and was awarded an honorary doctorate. So thank you so much for being here today, Zoe. It's really a pleasure to have you. And interviewing Zoe today will be our very own Dr. Gabe Bradshaw.
Thank you so much, Liz and Gay and everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here.
Well, welcome everyone, and welcome Zoe, and happy Women's Day today. You know, International All Women. All the, I don't know if Gur is here, but that's Liz's companion bird. Zoe, again, thank you so much for being here. Just to sort of situate and contextualize the listeners and viewers, give us a little background of you. We got a brief one with your short biography, but just kind of maybe give an arc of your your sort of journey over the time that led you to where you are now.
Well, thanks for asking that. I was actually thinking a lot about that question. And your focus in this webinar is on animal issues. And animal issues were the first issues that really spoke to me. And I also am very active in human rights issues as well as environmental issues. But the animals were what captured my heart when I was a child. I loved them, and I was deeply sensitive to any time there was any suffering that I saw among them. And I think that sensitivity to animals also explained my sensitivity toward people when I heard about terrible things that were happening in the world to people. And my first exposure to how things could be different for animals actually came when I was 13 years old. And I had been a gymnast, and I injured my back, and I had to stop doing gymnastics, which meant that after school, instead of practicing, I came home. And I was fairly despondent and didn't know what to do with myself. And so I turned on the TV and I discovered Star Trek, the original TV series. And I was completely hooked from the moment I saw the first episode. And it was actually Mr. Spock, the Vulcan logical character, who introduced me, yes, exactly, which I think during this coronavirus period, this is a great way to greet people and just say live long and prosper. So we can all take that away from this podcast, if nothing else. Anyway, Mr. Spock, the logical Vulcan, introduced me to the concept of vegetarianism. And he was a vegetarian, you know, in a series that was created in the mid-1960s. Here was this character who, not because he loved animals, because he was, you know, emotionless, but because it was the right thing to do. Why would you harm animals if you didn't have to? So that was my introduction to not harming animals. For something like food. It did take me many years to stop eating animals from that first exposure, but it was key to that arc that you just asked about. And then in high school, I watched Roots, the Alex Haley miniseries on TV. I actually forced myself to watch it as I sobbed hysterically through the whole thing. And then went on to read the autobiography of Malcolm X. And that really introduced me to social justice issues. And it's that arc moved fairly slowly for me until suddenly it all came together. And I realized I could do something personally. I could try to divest myself from harm to animals, so I could stop eating them and eventually stop eating any parts of them, like dairy or eggs. And I could become an active agent of change. So that was the arc.
So when you say you had that sort of epiphany or whatever, I'm going to ask you this question, see if it relates. A friend of mine, it sounds a little tangential, but it's no more tangential than Star Trek. They had a big family gathering of many different generations, I don't know, like 4 generations, family reunion. And someone got the idea, said, okay, everyone pass out a piece of paper and write down, what age you feel.
Oh.
And so anyway, there were babies, and then there were, the ancients and the elders, and sort of the theme that came out that my friend reported on to me was that people wrote down, and the year or the age that they wrote down was really a moment of coming into their own. And I guess it flashed on me when you talked about the realization of becoming an active agent, the kind of maybe a time of empowerment in a different kind of way. Was that your experience, or does that relate at all to to you now?
Well, it's a fascinating question, so I'm going to have to think about that. Where I find that a fascinating question. I would say that for me, I didn't grow up in a family that had any activists in it, so I didn't really know what it looked like to try to create change in the world. Because we had, I was definitely raised, you have to vote, but not that you have to be active in creating a better world. That just wasn't part of my upbringing. So I never really thought about that. And I ended up going to law school for a very short period of time, thinking I might want to be an environmental lawyer. This was before animal law existed, because otherwise I would have been thinking animal law at that point. But I didn't last very long, so I realized law was the wrong profession for me. And I ended up going to Divinity School to study comparative world religions. And I really wanted to understand at that point in my life, what were the philosophies around how we should treat other species and the environment in different world religions. So that's what I was looking at. And it was there that I got this taste of what activism might look like. Like I joined the Peace Club, and I started doing more activist things, leafleting, protesting, those sorts of things. And I have to admit, I didn't like doing those things. I felt a sort of responsibility to them once I learned about, this is what you do. And I started writing letters to legislators, those sorts of traditional forms of activism. But they were really hard for me. So what ended up happening is during the 2 years in graduate school, my husband, my then boyfriend, now husband, he was in graduate school in Philadelphia, and I was in the Boston area. And so I was looking for a summer job in Philadelphia, and I found a program at the University of Pennsylvania that offered week-long courses to middle school students. And there I was. I'd already been a little bit of a dilettante, even though I was still young in terms of where I'd been and what I'd studied. I had a master's degree in English literature at that point. So I pitched a whole bunch of courses to the director of the program, and one of them was on animal issues, because I loved animals and I was very passionate about these issues. And one was on environmental issues, and there were some others as well. She said yes to all of them. So I offered this animal issues course. It was the second most popular course of the 60 that were offered that summer, second only to robotics. And because I was a Star Trek fan, that was okay with me. You can be number 2 to robotics. So what was so amazing about that course was that the students were transformed over the course of a week. In one case, overnight. So each day I taught about a different issue, and then we'd go on some sort of field trip. And on the middle of the week, we talked about product testing on animals. So, where products are smeared onto the abraded skin of animals, all this, force-fed to animals in quantities that kill, dripped into their eyes of conscious rabbits, just ghastly things. And so our field trip that day was actually to the supermarket and the drugstore to see what products were tested on animals and whether we could find products that weren't tested on animals. And that night, one of the 12-year-old boys in the class made his own homemade leaflets against product testing. Now, this was in 1987. He did not have a computer. He hand wrote leaflets. And he came back into class the next morning and he wanted to hand them out, not to his fellow classmates, because they all knew about these issues. He wanted to hand them out on the street during lunch. So while we were having lunch, he was on a Philadelphia street corner handing out his homemade leaflets. So he'd become an activist overnight. And he was doing the kind of activism that I didn't like doing personally, which gets me to one of the most important things that I have to say today, which is, as each of us tries to figure out how we're going to make a difference in the world, it's so important to find the answer to where these 3 questions meet. 1, what issues do I care most about? 2, what am I good at? And 3, what do I love to do? Because if you can find the place where the answer to those 3 questions meet, your life's golden, because you will be successful, enjoy what you're doing, and it will be profoundly meaningful. And that summer, I found my life's work as a humane educator, as somebody who teaches about these ethical issues. In that case, it was animal issues, and I was also teaching the environmental course, and then I eventually created the Institute for Humane Education with a friend of mine, and we created the first graduate programs in humane education linking human rights and the environment and animals. And I was really lucky that I was able to find that place. Mm-hmm. And if we can each find it, then we can really make the world a more humane and peaceful and healthy place for everyone.
So I have like 5,000 questions, but I'll try to remember them all and pace it out. First of all, has anyone from that initial class contacted you? I can't believe that they haven't.
Oh, yes. In fact, I'm still in touch with 2 of them, relatively, like every year or so we're in touch. So one of them, he went on to work for the city of New York for the mayor on HIV/AIDS issues. And it was such a wonderful experience working with this young man. So I was out of touch with him for a few years, and I knew, though, that he worked for the mayor on these issues. And so when I was in New York, I don't know, this must have been about 10 years ago now, and I had the opportunity to be speaking at an event with Jane Goodall, which was pretty exciting. I invited him to come, and after the talks were over, I was introducing him to friends, and I said, "This is David." He was in the very first course I ever taught, and before I could even finish my sentence, he blurted out, "That course changed my life."
Oh, great.
And of course it had changed mine too. So that was a pretty wonderful moment.
That's fantastic. I don't have such a dramatic and politically motivating thing. I actually was able to give a lecture. I was lecturing, and my 6th grade teacher, her daughter happened to be in the university. And so I got to meet up with my 6th grade teacher, and she was Irish with black hair and very, very fair face. And she would like throw erasers, and those were the days when that was okay, right? Winging someone. And so I got to be able to say to her, when I was opening my lecture, saying, and I would like to thank, and I gave her name. I won't say it here, but anyway, so I got to see this red thing come up here of embarrassment. I got mine back. So you know, one of the things you brought up was this notion of alignment, and I have a part A and a part B. The part B is maybe you have suggestions of how do people bring those three. Is there a process or some things that you can suggest in terms of helping people bring those three things together? But the part A is, I wanted to comment, it's not a question, it's a comment. You know, it brings, you know, there's all these personality tests and the Enneagram, you know, which talks about, or the Myers-Briggs. And I think the utility of them, which I've seen in action when I was working for the government, I saw someone brought a facilitator and do the Myers-Briggs, and it really helped the interpersonal dynamics, the conflict. And I think what it was important about is understanding and appreciating and accepting that everyone has a particular orientation. Everyone has a particular modality which really resonates with them, and media by which they can interact with the collective in the world. So that's my comment. But part B is, do you have any you know, thoughts on how someone might approach of bringing those three questions into alignment or answering them?
So, you know, it's really just a matter of sitting down with each of those questions. Mm-hmm. And I'm imagining that people who are tuning in right now are mostly people who care about animal issues, which is why they're spending time on their Sunday tuning in. And so, you know, one can narrow that if one wants. So I'm one of those people who I could never narrow anything. You know, I cared passionately about all animal issues and passionately about human rights issues and passionately about protecting the environment. And so I went wide, but I found an umbrella for that in humane education. Mm-hmm. So for some people, it goes in the other direction. You know, they may care deeply about the environment or about animals, but when they hear about one specific thing, maybe it's factory farming, or maybe it's animal experimentation, or maybe it's animals used in entertainment, or maybe it's, you know, all of the dogs and cats who are being euthanized for lack of homes. Whatever it is, if there is something very, very narrow, it's useful to know, because it then becomes sometimes easier to think about how you can direct your energy towards solving it. And I'm going to get into what that might look like in a second. So I'll come back to that. So the question about what you're good at, you know, there are lots of things we might be good at. And I think it's really important to think big on that, because sometimes it's not obvious where the intersection is, but somebody could discover that they are really good at cooking, and they really love cooking. And so they become the next great vegan cookbook author. Or, you know, they want to stop factory farming, but they found this other way to do it that really fits with what they love to do and what they're good at. So really taking these questions separately first, it helps you, because it's when you see each separate category and you can say, oh, here's how I can put them together. Mm-hmm. And that gets into the thing that I wanted to also talk about, which is becoming a solutionary. So this is a word that we use at the Institute for Humane Education. And our vision and our goal is to educate people to create a world where all people, animals, and nature can thrive. And how do we do that? We do that by educating people to be solutionaries. Now, solutionaries aren't just problem solvers. Solutionaries are problem solvers, but who look at the root causes and the systemic causes of problems, and then they solve them in ways that do the most good and the least harm to everybody, to people, animals, and the environment. So if somebody, let's say, is passionate about solving human hunger in other countries, they might find themselves heading toward one of those organizations that provides livestock for those countries. Well, that would not be a solutionary solution from our perspective, because animals are going to be hurt in that process. It's not doing the most good and the least harm to everyone. It's not thinking about necessarily animals and the environment when trying to solve that problem. Now, let's say somebody was passionate about deforestation. They want to end deforestation, and so they want to make it illegal to cut down trees in a certain area where logging is the primary industry for a lot of people who are making a living in an area which maybe doesn't have a lot of industries. So if they are going full force toward ending logging, but not trying to solve the potential side effects and unintended consequences of people being put out of work, they're not being solutionary either. So a solutionary really has to address whatever issues that they're passionate about in a way that does the most good and the least harm for all. And if we can all think about that, so if we can answer those 3 questions and then strive to be a solutionary when we think about how we're going to put our energy into action and solve the problems we want to solve, I honestly think that we can solve the problems in the world. We can create a sustainable and just world.
So within that context, what you're really doing is in your institute, your personal work is really catalyzing cultural world change. Is that correct?
Sure, I love that. Yes.
That's your job title. Catalyst for like overall change. So this is a difficult point. What you brought up was really important. So in that notion of, we'll call it just for handy's sake, a paradigm shift. That you're catalyzing, then there are these moments of tension. So for example, you talked about the deforestation, or we'll stick with that one. So in the sense of that humans are losing their jobs, and yet there's this paradigm that I'm going to call it the colonial paradigm, for lack of the umbrella of a worldview that has been basically promulgated throughout from we call it Western Euro-America, whatever it is, that dominant thing which is very destructive. So a lot of the infrastructure which is supporting humans and a lot of the jobs that are supporting humans are very contradictory, and then they themselves are part of the problem. So I don't know if I'm making sense, but how does a solutionary work around the need to respect and support humans who may be instruments of pain and suffering and destruction of the natural world as such, but at the same time they themselves are part of that kind of I don't want to say victimization, but that they themselves are caught into that. How does a solutionary work with those tension points of making those paradigm shifts and yet retaining that kind of respect and support for those who are caught in this kind of bind?
It's a great question. So I have a few
thoughts. It was a long question. I could have made a shorter one.
I have a few thoughts about it. So we just produced a solutionary guidebook at the Institute, and it's available as a free download. So anybody can download it. You can go to our website, humaneeducation.org, and you can find it very easily. In the solutionary guidebook, we have a rubric, a scale of how to evaluate solutions on this solutionary scale, from emerging to developing to solutionary to most solutionary. So an emerging solution to, let's say, a problem is not actually solutionary. It might be something like, we have all this trash on the beach, we're going to do a beach cleanup. Or we have a lot of hunger in our community, we are going to do a food drive and support the food pantry. So those are really beautiful, wonderful things to do, but they don't solve the problem. So to be solutionary, again, has to address the root and systemic causes of the problem and solve them in a way that does the most good and the least harm to all. So developing might be, okay, we've addressed the root cause, but the solution we've come up with is harming one category in some way. It's doing good for some, harming others. So it's not quite there yet. Solutionary, it's really striving to do the most good and the least harm for all, and it's addressing the root and systemic causes. And then when you get to most solutionary, it's just, it's knocking it out of the park. It's very, very difficult to get to most solutionary. It's because of what you were just saying, Gay. This is, we live in these complex systems, and it is hard to transform them because they are interconnected, integrated, and it's very hard to come up with these changes. The one thing I would say is I'm not entirely sure it's a paradigm shift. And I'll tell you why. So one of the philosophy that I try to live by is doing the most good and the least harm to people, animals, and the environment through all my choices, from what I eat and what I wear, and what I do for work, and how I spend my time as a volunteer, or buying products, whatever it is. I'm striving to do the most good and the least harm. So I have asked thousands and thousands of people whether they think that this is a good philosophy by which to live. I call it the MOGO principle, MOGO being short for most good. And having asked thousands and thousands of people, nobody has ever said they don't think it's a good philosophy by which to live. It's essentially putting the golden rule into practice into in a complicated, globalized, interconnected world. So if virtually everybody I have ever asked, well, everybody I've ever asked, thinks it's a good philosophy by which to live, to me that suggests, and given how old and ancient the golden rule is, it's appeared in every philosophy and every religion. That was one of the things that I found really intriguing when I was studying world religions, 30-something years ago. So we hold these values, but we don't practice them very well. And, we have othered groups for as long as as long as we've had history. We have enslaved people throughout human history. Even today, there are 20 to 45 million people who are enslaved around the globe. We know how we've treated animals. We have treated women and girls without the same rights as boys and men. So we can hold both of these things simultaneously, that we should do the most good and least harm to people, animals, and the environment. Sounds good. And we have these structures that are still oppressive. However, I love the Martin Luther King Jr. quote, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." And it has been bending that way. And we see that with, 100 years ago, women couldn't vote. Here in the United States, in my own lifetime, the Civil Rights Act was passed. In my own lifetime, we've gone from a period of time where the concept of gay marriage was not on anybody's radar to the Supreme Court of the United States upholding this as a right. So that these changes are happening. And so is the shift in how we treat animals. So, a fairly recent Gallup poll said that the vast majority of people think that animals should be protected from abuse. Now, does that mean that the vast majority of people have translated that into what they eat or the products they use? Not necessarily, but I don't see it as much as of a paradigm shift as a movement, as an evolution in the direction that we already feel in our hearts. We just don't know how to practice these things, and the systems aren't in place to practice them. So I don't think we are that far away from, 90% plus people eating plant-based and cell-cultured animal products. I don't think we're that far away. I think that most people, and I've asked so many people, would you be willing to make that shift? If the systems were different, would you get those things instead? Sure, why not? Now, some people will say no, and some people will, still hunt and still raise animals on a small scale. But I think most people will go along with the new systems that are more humane and more sustainable, and that will be less of a paradigm shift and more of an evolution.
Well, it's interesting you're saying that, because your assessment of, we'll call it, just for a label, the animal rights movement, or the humane movement, we'll put it that way, is really quite extraordinary in terms of its change, which I agree. To me, it's sort of reeling every day when you get a news report. Granted, there's all those other quote unquote negative things, but it's like phenomenal the way you just described. And there's others in the movement as such who feel that I'll call it humane because that's the umbrella for human and animal, is kind of stuck in that way. So I find it very interesting that your perspective, and that, that there's these people who've been in the movement for a long time have these very different perspectives on its status and its trajectory. The other thing, not to get into, but you have this fabulous degree of comparative religion, and so I feel like I'm asking kind of a basic question. The reason, and the whole thing about paradigm, not to get academic about it, but I agree with that. I like the idea of evolution. That maybe you can also talk about in the sense of that a lot of the discussion that we have in terms of the environment and in terms of animals and all the things that we're talking about are still they're still within the envelope, we'll put it that way, of a very small segment of humanity from the anthropological record. So in other words, the culture that we say that is dominating right now, anthropologists, I don't know how the hell they do it, but they do. They've documented that it only represents, in terms of its value structure or its actions, 1% of the entire anthropological record. So 99% of the rest of humanity in time and space has really been like the morals that you're talking about and the values. So what about, do you think that that's going to be shifting as well, in terms of that the human identity will be changing?
I'm not sure I entirely understand the question. Will the human identity...
Excuse me, I had to tend to a very loud cat. I was talking louder and louder. I just decided I'll open the door. I guess what I mean is that well, I'm not sure. I guess I was just sort of making a point that a lot of the orientation of and again, I'm calling it the humane movement, is still very rooted in a particular segment of humanity. And in a sense that, and I don't know really what my point is. I guess I'm just talking about the notion of maybe the paradigm shift of understanding about how this is Jamie. You see him? He's our new feral puss that just came in the house. That in a sense, are indigenous people, again, that's an umbrella, are they really in the dialogue of this kind of change? In other words, I'm just trying to shift that kind of perspective. And and part of this is me in the middle of the night thinking about this notion of the different worldviews. And again, these are umbrellas. Whatever you want to call it, the colonial, whatever dominant thing, and then quote unquote indigenous, which is as varied as you can imagine. So well, I think maybe you can just, I don't know if I'm probably not really being very coherent on this, but there's a kind of an orientation in terms of the animal environmental movement, which is still rooted in this one kind of worldview.
So I don't know if it's rooted in one worldview any more than indigeneity is one worldview. As we know, I mean, I found Jared Diamond's book, Collapse, really a fascinating book. It's subtitled How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed. And it documents how different indigenous cultures responded very differently based on their physical surroundings. So while some managed to live really beautifully in harmony with their natural surroundings, others didn't. And if we just look at different indigenous cultures, even in the United States, there are very different ways different cultures, I mean, these are all different nations, would live in relationship to land and animals. It wasn't all the same. And so I'm not an anthropologist, and I'm not a historian. And so I don't feel equipped.
The catalyst for world change.
I don't feel equipped in a way to answer that question well. But I will say that, when sort of my guiding future has always been Star Trek, of course, because, you know, that was the deepest, most resonant vision of what the future could be, that the future could be a place where we're explorers without being conquerors. The future could be a place where we learned to treat each other and other species with respect, where we could have a prime directive where we don't interfere with another culture. I mean, those were visionary ideas that Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek, had. And so whenever I think about what the future looks like, I think that for me has meant that I do think about a sort of more and more technologically advanced culture. I never have thought of the sort of retreat and the back to the land. I mean, as we grow to, you know, 8.5 billion people, and we're heading toward 10 billion people, and half of people live in cities, I've never been able to wrap my brain around what it would look like to try to replicate more small, communal, no more than 100 people societies, like the vast majority of human existence on Earth. I don't know how we can do that with, you know, 8 going on 10 billion people. And so unless there were some terrible catastrophe that led us in that direction, I envision that the only way toward a society that truly manages to live in harmony is going to be a society that's also grappling with changes that we can't even anticipate. I mean, who could have anticipated that we could be doing this, what we're doing right now?
Oh, you know what I did? You know what I thought about? This is like about a year ago. Was, do you remember, you know, Captain Kirk would be, or, you know, they would contact Starbase, and I went, oh my God, that's Skype. Really, you know, I had this flash. I'm like, oh my God, that's just Skype.
Yeah. So I'm not answering your question at all, except to say,
no, you are.
Okay, all right.
The reason why, and I realized what was percolating in my head. Partly, I was distracted because Jamie's here, but because essentially, what I was really getting at is what has motivated this webinar series. You know, our tagline is, "We know what's wrong, but what does right look like?" Yeah. And again, that was kind of precipitated by my conversation with some young activists, and I sort of said, well, what's your vision of the, you know, like 5 years, 10 years, or whatever, if we get what we want in terms of, you know, stopping animal exploitation, et cetera, how do we live? You know, that's right. Peter Singer's, which I love that thing. How are we to live? Yeah. And so essentially that was the motivation for this webinar. And what I heard from you, which I really like, is that you're saying, you know, I've been saying, what's the vision of the future, which I think is really important. But at the same time, you're saying there are principles. In other words, we may not know. We climb up a mountain, we say, okay, we want to get there. Mm-hmm. But as we climb up the mountain, we may get there going, oh, well, the terrain looks really different. But if we have these guiding moral or ethical principles, then essentially that provides a very powerful compass, despite the kind of the changes that can't necessarily be anticipated.
Yeah, I love that, Gay. And thank you for, in some sense, synthesizing what I was saying into something even better. We used to, in our graduate programs, we used to have the students read Derek Jensen's book, The Culture of Make-Believe, which is a 650-page book, you know, 600 pages of which are like everything that's wrong. And then the end is, you know, okay, what do we need to do? And the take-home point that he has is we need to end civilization. Now, I don't find that personally to feel satisfying at all as the take-home point of everything that's wrong, and what we have to do is end civilization. So the assignment that the students had to complete for when they read that book was write your own ending for this book. And I don't see ending civilization as an answer. I see it as, okay, that means, you know, it's all that we couldn't actually find a way to, with a solutionary mindset and a solutionary lens that we bring to all of the problems that we face in the world, it would mean to me that we couldn't find a way to create economic, political, production, food, energy, construction, legal, and all other systems that were just and sustainable and humane. That's what it would mean to me. But I actually believe that we can do that. And that's, so in some sense, this is why we focus at the Institute for Humane Education on transforming the educational system. So that's the system we are trying to address, because we believe that the education system underlies all other systems. That, there's a reason why the title of my book is The World Becomes What We Teach. Mm-hmm. I believe that the world will become what we teach. And if we educate young people and we give them the knowledge and the tools and the motivation to solve problems using a solutionary lens, and with the most good, least harm principle underlying everything, if we do that, we will see these problems in the world become resolved in ways we don't know. We can't anticipate. I do not have the solutions to all of the problems. I think there's some ideas that are phenomenal solutions, and I support those. But what I think is essential is that we raise people to think in this way. And I just have to tell you that we are having some success with this that is so beautiful and inspiring. So earlier this week, I was in New York, and there's a school district, Oceanside School District on Long Island, and the head of social studies, Mitch Bickman, he is bringing this solutionary approach to the social studies curriculum for all the grades. So on Tuesday, the fifth graders, the entire fifth grade in different sections, came and were mentored by the 10th and 11th graders who have already been studying how to be solutionaries. Mm-hmm. And they were introduced at what was called the World We Want Fair to their solutionary work, which they will now have from fifth grade through high school. Every year they were going to be learning how to be solutionaries. So they were introduced to the Sustainable Development Goals. They were introduced to critical thinking and systems thinking and to action, taking action. And it was so beautiful and so inspiring to be there. And next Sunday, unfortunately, this was just canceled because of coronavirus, but there are 113 teams, student teams in San Mateo County, California. That's the county between San Francisco and Palo Alto, who have produced solutionary ideas to share at the first Solutionary Expo. Now, San Mateo County, California, which serves 113,000 students in 23 school districts, has adopted our solutionary approach for the entire county. So it's become embedded in the professional development that they are providing to their teachers. 130 teachers went through summer institutes, developed solutionary units, delivering them in their classrooms. And that's where these teams of students, more than 100 teams, were doing this. So we're going to be producing a solutionary YouTube channel to showcase these student solutions. So I'm really sad that the expo was canceled because of coronavirus, but these students will still be able to share their solutions in this way, and we'll spread it. And can you imagine if this takes hold? I mean, if this takes hold, then education will have this much deeper purpose to educate the solutionary generation. And who knows how all of these systems will change for the better, but they will.
Mm-hmm. Have you heard of a documentary called Schooling the World?
I feel like is it about 10 years old now? Or
it probably is. You can get it on YouTube in segments.
Okay.
But it's very interesting because it basically is very sobering. It talks about this systemic movement of education. Right. And so it really speaks to in a negative way.
Right.
But it really speaks to what you're saying in terms of the potency of changing at a systemic level, the narrative.
And schooling has always had this power, and we've seen it. I mean, the native populations in the United States, there is a genocide that has been committed upon these nations, and that's direct killing, putting people on reservations. But there was also this other genocide, which was occurring by taking children away from their families and putting them into American schools, native children being forbidden to speak their native languages and put into these boarding schools. And that was its own genocide. You take away the culture of a nation and all of its values and prevent people from speaking their language. So that shows the power of education for the negative. And of course, Hitler knew this. I mean, think about Nazi youth and all of these parents who were scared of their children because their children were being taught to be little mini Nazis. So schooling is profoundly powerful. So let's do it right.
So I'm just recalling your three questions in the beginning of our conversation are really important also as keeping negotiating the individual and the collective relationship in a positive way. So that right there, in other words, really taking deeply, as you're suggesting and encouraging those three questions, is something that is also an antidote for the sort of negative promulgation of schooling messages and schooling narratives. And so it's that retaining the participation, the agency of individuals, as opposed to what your examples of here in the United States and a large part of the rest of the world in terms of the colonial paradigm and in Germany with Hitler and Europe in that way.
Yes. That's exactly right. It's giving agency to youth. What did they care about? I mean, the idea that we are still teaching kids facts, memorize this, when, they have devices that can give them all the facts. What they need to be able to do is be able to tell whether something is fact or it's opinion or it's, fake.
Or it's
That's what they need to be able to do. They don't need to be able to tell you what date something happened in history. They need to understand the arc of history.
I'm going to squeeze in one more question because I know that people have wanting to make comments and ask you questions. And that is to say, so from the perspective then of animal sentience and I would say life sentience all over trees and plants and everything, how do you see becoming more inclusive in terms of their participation in the evolution toward the future?
Yeah, that's a big question.
So it's not only just stopping what we do to them, but how do we stop whatever we're doing that excludes them from being very active and agentic in terms of this globe, the entire life?
Yes, it's a really powerful question. I mean, the first thing we do need to do is stop harming them and stop taking away their homes on planet Earth. And, in the case of those we have imprisoned and, on our factory farms and in laboratories and all sorts of things, if we stop oppressing and exploiting them, we also won't be breeding them. So some will no longer, we won't have them in the numbers we have them. If you think about how many cows there are on Earth or how many chickens there are on Earth, we won't have that many cows and chickens on Earth, these animals that we created for ourselves. What that looks like for the ones who remain, hopefully we can live in harmony and kindness with them. I'm one of those people who don't want to see us not having relationships with other animals. I think that the relationships not only that humans have with non-human animals who we have domesticated, but that they have with each other, that if we can learn to do that in a way that is not harmful and non-exploitive, is so beautiful and so powerful, and is the window into really looking at all species. I mean, we think about, you know, how many of us adore and love with all of our hearts the animals with whom we share our homes. And if we can extend that compassion to the other animals who we share this planet with, not only the ones we've domesticated but harm, like the ones we eat, but also wild animals all around us. You know, it's that window. You know, I'm looking at Gur, the bird, periodically thinking, yes, Gur, who lives with Liz, is our window to look at every bird with that open heart and imagining how we then share this planet with other species. And again, I don't know exactly how that looks, but let's end the exploitation and open our hearts, and let's see where that takes us.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for the perfect segue, and Gur thanks you as well for acknowledging that she's in the room. So just real briefly before we switch over to question and answer, I just wanted to do a quick plug for next month. So for those of you who are here, and also if you know other folks that would be interested, next month on April 5th, we will be joined by Corey Cohen, and he will be presumably talking about dogs, although I'm assuming. But yeah, I hope you all join us there. So
Corey's present right now. So.
He is present. He's waving. So yeah, we hope we'll see you next month on April 5th.